As always, we appreciate your comments and your attendance. Next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion on any of the consent agenda items? Seeing none, we'll call for a vote. That does pass unanimously. Next item on the agenda is the core curriculum material for secondary high school English language arts and interpretation translation programs. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? We were fortunate to have the CMAC minutes in the board briefing again, which we will always appreciate.
Do we have parents that sit on that committee? We do. Okay, that's right.
Seeing no further questions, we'll call for a vote. And then that passes unanimously. Next item on the agenda is second reading of board policy number 4215, use of tobacco and nicotine products and delivery devices. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call for a vote. And again, that passes unanimously. Next item on the agenda is second reading of board policy number 4312, complaints concerning staff or programs. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there any discussion?
I would like that, and maybe it already is, but if you could clarify that this be posted clearly on our website. So parents, this has been one of the questions that we've been asked is what is the process to go through if you're not having something resolved at your local school? And I think if we had this more clearly placed, it might relieve some of the questions and anxiety around what to do next when people want to take it further, take the issue further.
Is it, right now, is it just accessible through electronic school board? Is that in the midst of all of our other policies? Is that where it is?
Well, I know it's there. I would need to do some research to see if it's referenced or linked in other places on the website. I'm not going to answer that question right now.
Suggestion.
Is there board consensus on that? Any other discussion?
Yeah, I believe this was brought back, and was that the reason that you brought it back, or from the last meeting? But I was going to ask that about some of the suggestions I've made about this particular policy. So this is what we're calling our whistleblower policy, correct?
No,
No,
this is
whistleblower.
not. Sorry. There's a different policy that references the whistleblower law. This is simply under community relations, complaints concerning staff or programs.
Okay, so it's under community. Where is the whistleblower policy then?
That's in the 5000 series. It's under personnel policies. It is 52.
71.
5270.
71.
5271.
And when is that coming for us? Scheduled?
I don't have the schedule in front of me of policy review to know exactly when the 5000 series comes back again. I would need to look, get back on that.
Let me look and see when.
I'm all the way up to say I don't know. It's not on the schedule for next year.
Yeah, it was reaffirmed last in 2012, and it's a 5-year cycle, so I would presume it would be during either the 16-17 or 17-18 school year.
So what was the policy number again?
527. Reporting improper governmental action.
5271? Okay, thank you.
The reason why I brought this back to clarify is because I wanted to know the procedures behind this, because of all the questions that we've been asked in the community, so that's why we were.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the procedure was loaded in there for everybody's information. We're approving policy tonight, so.
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But I also want to know the procedures behind
Sure.
it to understand the policy.
All right, seeing no further discussion, we'll call for a vote. And that does pass unanimously. Next item on the agenda is the second reading of board policies number 9220, finance, 9245, acceptance of completed projects, and 9280, State Environmental Policy Act compliance. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second. Any discussion on this? Seeing none, we'll call for a vote. And again, unanimous. Next items on the agenda are information items. District budget status report for April 2015 is the next item. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
I think Lydia is.
So I'm going to scroll. So my question is, it was noted that we did receive our first half of 2015 property taxes. So I noticed in the general fund, our unassigned fund balance took quite the jump. So it's just helpful for me to understand the process by which, from a timing perspective, because when you see the spike in the graph, it looks very high, but is that getting put into expenditures quickly? What kind of time period does that get drawn down? Maybe. Yes. Okay, I need to clarify. Okay.
So one thing, I'm not sure if this mic is working.
Yes.
Okay. One thing I had Chris look at is where we were at in April for each of the last 3 years preceding, and how much of the fund balance was drawn down between April and August. Because we receive the bulk of our property taxes in April. We receive kind of a residual amount that ties to the spring collections in May. And then by the end of May, we will be at approximately 99% of our collections and really won't receive any significant amount until next October, which is another school year. So this basically carries us through the end of the school year. So Chris shows a trend that we should draw down about 15 million between now and the end of August, because the bulk of those collections will be done after next month. We still receive state apportionment, but this has to provide for the summer months when we're not really receiving any property tax collections of any significance. The second thing is we are a little delayed on a few bills. One example is Cascadia Community College was very late in billing us for spring quarter.
About how much is that?
350,000. We also are seeing a bit of a needed adjustment in this graph. In previous years, I believe last year was the first year that elementary teachers received their overloads in 2 periods instead of 3 quarterly periods, that we put them in line with the secondary teachers. So instead of them receiving a second quarter's overload payment in approximately March, they'll receive a semester in July. So that delays that payment in overload compensation according to the contract.
And again, rough estimate of how much that is?
Probably 250.
Okay.
And then finally, the one that I don't have good numbers on is all of the startup costs for North Shore Primary Center were put on hold, and or the orders weren't made yet, as they're reconvening the plans and the needs at Frank Love that are different than the original needs of the primary center. So we would have already started to order those classroom desks and bookshelves and books and things, and that had to be put on hold, so you'll see those expenditures come later in the summer.
That helps me, thank you.
Sure.
Before you leave, any other questions from board members? All right, thank you, Lydia. Okay, next under information items is the signed agreements for North Creek High School. Any questions on any of that? Pretty straightforward. All right, seeing none, we'll move to the next, which is annual summary of North Shore School District's affirmative action report for 2014-15. This is an annual report. Any questions?
Do we break, I saw that we break down that, I don't know if we put together that report or someone puts it together for us.
Jeff Sherwood, do you want to, oh, Doug Hale. We get 2 for 1.
I said screens for Doug.
Yeah. We put together the report.
And so when we put together the report for the next year, is it possible to have it broken down by what minority groups we're hiring? Because I just see that it's lumped into one, 10% minority for teachers, let's say.
It's certainly possible to do that.
Is that a lot of extra work or?
No, historically, because the goals, I would say, are relatively modest from a percentage basis. That's based on labor market statistics in both the local areas as well as statewide where we recruit. We haven't included the subgroups, but it's easy enough to do that, certainly.
And then I noticed, like for our elementary teachers, obviously we have many more women teaching. Do we try to recruit more men for those jobs?
That's
That would
exactly
be
what
nice.
yeah.
I mean, because, understanding that equity goes both ways.
Being male is not a protected class, so we. Being tall. Yeah, being male is not a protected class. It wouldn't be legal to have goals for males.
I see, okay. That's good information.
I have a question. Do we receive funding for meeting or not meeting the goals under this plan?
No.
Yeah, not to my knowledge, no.
Funding?
Interestingly enough, the requirement for affirmative action plans in Washington State is narrowly confined to public school districts. There was an initiative several years ago that eliminated affirmative action in almost every state and local jurisdiction, but there's is one requirement in the WACs requiring the school districts to have affirmative action plans. So there's no funding attached. And there was a recent change. OSBI doesn't even require us to file the reports with them anymore. We just have to have one.
Do you have to present it to the board?
Yeah, there's a requirement that we
By
do
the
an
WAC.
annual report to the board.
Okay.
And when I'm just thinking, I'm coming back to the elementary, can we try to recruit more male minority teachers then? Since we're at 88% female, and 10% of those are, 10% of that 100% is minority, can we look to recruit more male?
The historical underrepresentation, and I don't have the report in front of me, is for racial minorities in elementary education, not specifically black males. So, or Hispanic males or Asian males. So that would be problematic, separating those out that way.
This was part of the discussion at the equity conference that I went to. Just the lack of available applicants is a problem, and how do we encourage more minorities to follow that path, to choose. And I was just reading an article this week about the what we pay teachers is a part of the reason why they don't pursue it, because it was just an opinion that someone gave, but there is not a great financial gain to choosing to be in education, and according to this article, that's a factor in there as well, so, it's a conundrum.
I guess what I'm asking is, Portland, I had started researching some of the different districts and their equity diversity plans, and Portland Public Schools actually has, as part of their equity diversity, an actual team that does recruit minority applicants, and they're actively doing that as part of their plan. And so that's what I was wondering, because as I've been searching the internet for what are different school districts doing with these conversations, and then that got me thinking that maybe we could more actively have this as part of what we're doing.
We attend many recruiting events. This is Joey on, sorry.
Can you just lift it up? There you go.
There we go. We attend a lot of recruiting events, and we take teams to a lot of different recruiting events in the Puget Sound area. We actively recruit. The numbers of minority applicants in our applicant pools are small, and we actively work the recruiting circuit in Washington State. We actively line our applicant pool to make sure we're reaching out to applicants, but it's, as Janet points out, the number of minorities in our teaching applicant pools are very small.
I had the opportunity to talk to one of the team members that went to these recruiting fairs, and he said in addition to the low numbers, typically minorities want to get back to their community, and North Shore isn't perceived as having a population that is a member of their community. We're still seen as a very white community, and so that was kind of a double whammy on us, in addition to low numbers, that we struggled to get that word out that we do have minorities in our district, enough so that they can feel like they're giving back to their community.
So I believe this really ties into a conversation that we're having later about institutional racism, which I believe is a large part of the problem. When the majority of our teachers are one color, homogenous and female, usually people of color get different treatment. And so I think that that's something that needs to be addressed within the system, and starting earlier seems to me the way to get more people of color involved later on wanting those jobs.
It's a complex issue.
Thank you very much. All right, let's see. We'll move on to policy reviews. We have first reading of board policy 7230, advertising, partnerships, and sponsorships. 7260, gifts, which is the one you asked about, Kimberly. 7326, unclaimed or reissued warrants, and 7330, payroll authorization and control, and 7331, pay periods. Do board members have any questions on these?
I'd just like to know what Director D'Angelo asked about in gifts.
The gifts policy is the policy under which the science teachers are funded. So that was the context of what you asked about. I don't want to manufacture questions.
No, I
so
heard
yeah.
That was, no, thank you.
So any discussion on
This
these?
is, we could hire a science teacher for every elementary building. That'd be great. And have it equitable.
Yeah. We had, I don't know, Larry thinks it was 6 readings of this policy the last time.
It was
came up
it
for
was the
reviews.
all-time leader in readings, for sure.
Well, except for
And-
tuition, of course.
No, that's good, that comes up every year.
And the major policy discussion was around the permissibility or the advisability of allowing basically community or PTA groups to fund staff positions and whether that was equitable or not. And we bandied around a number of different ideas, including sort of an equity contribution, that would have to come to the district to be repurposed, or a number of different ideas about how to perhaps make it more equitable, and ultimately came to the conclusion that that was probably going to be a disincentive for those parent and community groups to want to contribute, because they want to contribute to their local school. And although there was great recognition of the inequitability of that, the board ultimately decided they didn't want to deny the opportunity for those school communities that did want to fund additional positions to be able to do so.
Let me ask, does like our higher percentage, schools with a higher percentage of minority populations, like Crystal Springs, correct? North Shore Junior High, do they have science? Are their PTAs able to fund science? Because I know East Ridge has a science.
There are only 3, right?
There's Bear Creek,
Those are the
Sunrise.
wealthy schools, per se, let's say, and they're with the less minority populations.
Right. So, correct. And that was the large, that's the 6 or 7 readings. That was the major part of the conversation. So there are some staffing, district-provided staffing, that does follow the demographics of the school. So for example, as you know, Title I staffing, or ELL staffing, or Learning Assistance Program staffing, although that's changed a little bit in recent years. Those are some staffing and funding streams that generally follow the demographics of a school. So if a school has a more challenged demographic, they're going to receive more of that kind of funding and that kind of staffing than a school that doesn't have that kind of demographic. So it's not apples to apples, because it's not parent provided or community provided, but there is at least that mechanism within our own funding and our own staffing that accounts for some of those kinds of differences across school communities.
Are any of our schools using Title I funds to fund a science teacher?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think that would be a permissible use of Title I funding. Becky's shaking her head at me, so.
They're not.
So I guess, and maybe this is part of the next conversation, I guess again, that's my concern, is that, we have the 3 schools where there is a predominantly more wealth, and so the PTAs have more money, and they're able to fund this, and then we have the schools that don't have this, that don't have the same wealth and within their PTAs, and then they're not able to fund it. So I don't know if we can talk about this in part of our next, when we talk about the equity, diversity conversation, but it seems to me that, again, that's a piece, another component of that. And the achievement gap.
Well, and I'd like to bring them to, like you said, if it's a model that's working well for these schools, which, having a kid come through Sunrise, I just happen to know a little bit more about it, but I think there probably is some proof that we could say it does help, and then perhaps when we're having budgetary conversations, if the idea is if it's helpful to have a science specialist at an elementary school level, then we can rope it into some budgetary conversations too.
Is there proof that this helps? Sorry, you're saying that anecdotally. Do we have any measuring from the students that have this in their schools versus the students that do not have a science teacher in their schools? Do you have any comparison?
I think the 5th grade
Data.
science scores.
5th grade science MSP score would be the
Could take a peek.
most readily accessible comparison point. I'd also would just point out too that different communities give to different things. I mean, it's ultimately up to the individual PTAs and the leadership of those groups. So we have in recent years, the board has approved significant donations for, say, playground equipment at Crystal Springs, or playground equipment at Frank Love or Kenmore Elementary even a couple of years ago. So it's not as if there's no community or PTA resources being provided to those schools, but they're being provided for what the PTA is choosing to support and fund. And in a handful of schools, they've chosen over the years to support and fund some staff positions.
I think too, and again, maybe this is a different conversation, but when we're talking about the achievement gap and we talked about putting some funds towards reducing that, these might be areas that we think about.
So Kimberly, can I clarify, because I'm hearing two different conversations. Did we want to talk about issues with inequity of PTA funding at schools, or did you want to talk about science teachers at the elementary school level?
I think science is part of that, it sounds like, but yes, inequity of PTA funding at the schools.
Okay.
I think it is a dual conversation.
Okay, so it's in lay in that.
Well, I
And-
think it's a good point.
I
I'm sorry.
wasn't arguing either way. Okay. I think it's a good conversation. It was a very robust conversation we had many meetings.
Because this was before we.
Right, but yeah, so I think it probably is healthy to have that again, just to get that understanding of how we finally laboriously got to this and the struggles that you have sort of dealing with inequity versus not wanting to shut down fundraising at a school. So,
For the next board briefing, we get more information regarding this for, at least for my benefit and maybe Amy's benefit, that we weren't part of the conversation.
No, we've pretty much captured the essence of the conversation. You know, what Larry said. I would recommend that you read the gift policy through the filter of what you heard tonight. And then if something is, if you want to bring something up next week.
And I would just want to make one comment again, just because it's my neighborhood school, so I know Sunrise has only 280 students. They haven't had, and maybe they do this fall, they haven't had enough volunteers to actually staff ahead of fundraising. It's actually tricky for them to raise the money. So, you know, something just to make sure perhaps a good idea is to look at the three schools and their situations separately, you know, in terms of, we're talking about the gifting and what's going on behind it. I think I don't want to just, like, we don't try to do this with any of our schools, it's just kind of lump them together. The different communities, I would imagine, have different viewpoints in terms of why they're raising the money and how they're raising the money.
And Dawn, did you want to answer?
It is a dual conversation.
Yeah, so
And I think that to provide equity, the district could choose to provide
yes.
what the schools are providing. And especially if we have data showing that that's a useful piece, that is in interest of closing the achievement gap, that is something that we should probably look at pretty hard. For sure. Do it.
So I think you mentioned that's part of, or Sandy, that it's part of the budget conversation. So a little outside the gift policy conversation. So if we just look at the policy as a policy and decide whether or not that's going to work, and then separately have conversations about the budget, how we want to allocate funding to address some of the inequity issues. And then again in the item number 21, revisit some of the inequity conversation part of it as well. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, and I would agree, except when are you suggesting that we look at the budget to have that discussion? We're on a budget schedule.
We have no information from Olympia to tell us what our budget will be yet, so that's a little challenging, but it's part of our summer work. Once the legislature decides, then we can meet and talk about that. Do you have another question, comment?
Well, I look forward to that conversation.
All right.
I would just add that it's not directly related, but one of the messages we've been carrying to our legislators, particularly around K-3 class size reduction, is the need to make any movement in that area flexible. Like many districts, we could not achieve K-3 classroom, self-contained classroom sizes of 17 to 1. We simply do not have the physical space to be able to do that. So we would need greater flexibility to be able to use teachers in different ways instructionally. And science specialists, reading specialists, math specialists, any number of needs could be different ways we could get more teachers working with kids without necessarily being able to get to hard and fixed classroom ratios of 17 to 1. So we've been conveying that message to our legislators pretty consistently. And they seem receptive and understanding of each.
I just want to add, it's a little bit difficult, so I apologize when three of you guys have known, you have the benefit of having a conversation a couple of years ago, and I'm feeling a little in the dark about it. So that's not anyone's fault, but I'm kind of coming from not having that frame and trying to kind of navigate it. So it's a little tricky.
Anytime there's a new opportunity to revisit the policy, it's with a new group of people often, and so we did the same thing when we revisited it. Just came at it through the filter of what is our perspective on it, and just had a pretty robust 6-meeting discussion on what the outcome would be.
Right, but we're not having that same discussion though, so you guys were able to, because you guys have already had it in the past, you guys probably learned a lot through having that conversation, is what I'm saying. So I'm just trying to get up to speed. And maybe I can talk to Sherry too about some of that. And get more information.
Sandy, is there anything that Larry didn't say that you recall specifically from the
Well, no, I
conversation?
think Sherry is an excellent idea, but certainly PTA at council level struggles with that issue of how do we allow individual schools to
And
access.
projecting beyond the current board year.
Yeah.
You're really not supposed to commit
I mean,
your board beyond 1 year.
Sherry, I'm going to stop you. I'm sorry.
But, it's not our
You
struggle.
can explain it to me.
Yeah, you can connect later.
We're not the only district that struggles with this. Seattle has it in an extreme level, the difference in their schools and ability to fundraise. So it's an ongoing conversation. It's not an easy one, and I don't know that any of us thought, perfect, this is the solution and all our problems are solved. I think we all kind of stomached it as, all right, that's about the best we can do in this situation.
And I think what I'm saying, Kimberly, is that if you are bringing a different perspective to it and you want to have the conversation again, that's what we're here for.
I have to reread it again, and I'm going to meet with Sherry so I can have a fuller perspective, because I just feel like I'm not educated enough on it at this moment.
Okay.
And we're coming back to this next time.
This will be on for action item next meeting. All right, seeing no further discussion, we'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is first reading of board policy number 9400, enrollment demographics task force. Did board members have any questions on this?
So with our changing demographics in the district, and we've seen how at a couple board meetings, how the boundary changes are affecting our Hispanic community members. When we make the decision to put people on our task force, are we looking specifically, or could we look specifically at including some of our diverse demographics, like the Hispanic community, and when someone goes off the task force, being deliberate about adding someone from that community onto the task force?
We certainly can. We generally fill those through an open application position. So we might need to look at how we outreach for that a little bit differently. But to be fair to everybody who has an interest, and for many years there was a high level of interest in the enrollment demographics task force. That was kind of what led us to the open application position. So the short answer is yes, and we're always looking for regional balance, certainly across that particular task force, so that we have all areas of the district covered. But I think the point's well taken about trying to look for different levels of diversity. But we'll probably have to do some greater levels of recruitment and outreach to make that happen.
And maybe